You think cowboys rode into saloons just for whiskey? Think again. Those Wild West watering holes doled out some of the oddest, richest, and most unexpected meals on the frontier. From deep-fried bull testicles to sourdough pancakes kept in saddlebags, these are not campfire tall tales. They were real dishes served to real gunslingers across the American West. Let's dig into 25 cowboy recipes you probably did not know actually appeared on saloon menus in the Wild West. Son of a gun stew. It sounded like a punchline until you looked at the pot. Son of a gun stew was the frontier's don't ask, just eat supper. And yes, saloons from Dodge City to Abilene really served it. The dish grew out of trail life when cowboys butchered cattle on the move and used every scrap of the animal. Not just out of thrift, but because they had to. Waste meant weakness. The stew blended organ meats such as tripe, heart, liver, marrow, gut, sweetbreads, and sometimes brain, all simmered in a thick, peppery broth with potatoes, onions, and on occasion carrots or wild herbs. In some places it became a rite of passage. A man's grit was measured not by his gun hand, but by whether he could finish a whole bowl. Why a saloon staple? It was simple, filling, calorie-dense, and cheap. Cattle towns on the edge of settlement lacked prime cuts but had guts, a hot stove and cast iron. For trail-tired cowboys, a steaming bowl of son-of-a-gun stew was survival. Sourdough flapjacks. Before protein bars and greasy spoon breakfasts, cowboys ate flapjacks. Large, flat pancakes made from wild cultured sourdough starter that some riders kept in tins lashed to their saddles. These were more than food. They were a frontier custom, and starters were guarded like treasure. The batter was stirred with water, flour, and salt. No sugar, and fried in bacon grease until the edges crisped and the center stayed tender. The sour tang came from weeks or even months of fermentation. These flapjacks were dense, chewy, and filling, and saloons commonly paired them with molasses, pork drippings, or canned fruit if a rail line reached the town. In those bars, flapjacks showed up morning, noon, or midnight, depending on who stumbled in and how long they'd been on the road. Some folks called them sinkers because they landed in your stomach like a rock. But that was the point. They were not delicate breakfast cakes. They were survival carbs, fried in cast iron to carry you through a gunfight or a 10-mile ride in the cold. And the best part? The last pancake on the plate usually got the extra spoonful of syrup, if any remained. Fried salt pork and beans. No dish screams Wild West like a bowl of beans. Fried salt, pork, and beans, though, was more than a trope. It was a staple of frontier life, showing up in nearly every saloon west of the Mississippi. Salt pork, a fatty preserved cut cured in heavy salt brine kept without refrigeration for months in barrels. Saloons sliced it thick, fried it in its own fat until browned and crisp, then ladled it over beans, typically pinto or navy beans that had been simmering for hours over a low fire. Molasses, onions, and lard were frequent flavorings, but when supplies ran thin, the meal could be nothing more than pork grease and beans. And you can bet it was tasty. Add a hunk of day-old sourdough or cornbread and you had food that could keep a cowboy riding from dawn to dusk. Beans were offered by the bowl, the plate, or the pan, often brought straight from the cook's fire to the bar. Some saloons even served them around the clock, because no one working cattle wanted to drink on an empty stomach. Chuckwagon coffee. Some folks dubbed it six-shooter brew. Others called it liquid tar. But every cowboy understood that chuckwagon coffee was more than a drink. It was the trail's lifeline. It was brewed so strong it could float a horseshoe, usually made in dented tin kettles with coarse grounds tossed straight into boiling water. To help the ground settle, trail cooks used eggshells, crushed beans, or sometimes a pinch of salt or even a scrap of rawhide. Saloons often kept a blackened pot simmering on the stove all day, refilled every few hours but seldom scrubbed out. You could step in, lay a coin or a pinch of gold dust on the bar, and get a steaming tin cup of jet black coffee that served as both a conversation starter and a hangover cure. Cowboys drank it before breakfast, after poker, and sometimes in place of sleep. If you were lucky, the barkeep might toss in a splash of whiskey to fix the flavor. Prairie oysters, Rocky Mountain oysters. No rundown of saloon fare would be complete without the Old West's most notorious treat. Prairie oysters, known today as Rocky Mountain oysters. Despite the name, they are not seafood. They are deep-fried bull testicles, served hot and crisp after cattle roundups and brandings. Cowboys wasted nothing, not even the bits most people preferred to ignore. After the cattle were castrated, the organs were cleaned, sliced, coated in flour and spices, and plunged into hot tallow. Saloons across Colorado, Wyoming, and Texas served them fresh, often during branding festivals or beef days. They came with hot sauce, vinegar, mustard, or simply plain, and were typically chased with beer or rye. You did not eat prairie oysters to be refined. You ate them to prove you were tough, local, and proud. In some towns, turning down a plate was a quick way to get laughed out of the bar. Rabbit stew. In the Wild West, when beef was too costly or simply not available, cowboys ate what they could hunt, and rabbit was often the choice. Light, lean, and common across the plains, rabbit found favor with chuckwagon cooks and saloon kitchens serving working travelers. The stew used whatever was on hand: potatoes, onions, carrots, and sometimes turnips or wild herbs. Cooks first seared the meat in pork fat or tallow, then let it simmer slowly until it was tender enough to drop from the bone. It was not a refined dish. It was rugged frontier cooking at its best. In parts of New Mexico and Arizona, some saloons gave rabbit stew a southwestern twist, seasoning it with chilies, cumin, and garlic, a blending of cowboy fare with Mexican and native food traditions. The result was hearty, warming, and with more complexity than you might expect. This was not food for outlaws or gamblers. Rabbit stew was made for cowhands who had spent a week in the saddle, tired of hardtack and beans, craving something that reminded them of a home they had not seen in years. Squirrel fricassee, yes, squirrel. On the frontier, squirrel meat was not just eaten, it was common and expected. Cheap, plentiful, and surprisingly tasty, squirrel became a saloon regular in wooded regions from Missouri to Arkansas, especially when cattle were too expensive. Fricassee, a technique brought by European settlers, involved lightly pan-frying the squirrel, then simmering it in a gravy often created from the drippings, flour, and milk. The outcome was tender meat in a creamy, peppery sauce, usually served over biscuits or cornbread. You did not see this advertised on a front sign. It was the sort of dish you heard about through the back door or learned from the barkeep. Squirrel fricassee was a local's meal, evidence that saloons were more than just places for whiskey. They were community kitchens where people knew how to make the most of what lived in the trees. Corn Dodger biscuits. Corn Dodgers were dense, hand-shaped biscuits made from cornmeal, boiling water, a pinch of salt, and sometimes bacon drippings or pork grease. Shaped into ovals or small patties, they were fried, baked on hot rocks by the campfire, or crisped in skillets. In saloons, cooks sometimes dressed them up with a spoonful of molasses or served them alongside beans and stew. Their texture was gritty, the flavor smoky with a touch of sweetness, and they kept for days in a saddlebag without spoiling, which made them ideal on the trail. Some cowboys wrapped them in cloth and tucked them into bedrolls overnight so they could reheat them at dawn. In saloon life, corn dodgers functioned like bread rolls in a modern diner. To a cowboy, though, they were a taste of home and hunger answered by plain, stubborn sustenance. Pickled eggs. You have seen them in old saloon movies. Cloudy glass jars filled with pale eggs bobbing in brine on dusty counters. That was not just a prop. Pickled eggs were an actual cowboy snack, especially for men too poor or too hurried to buy a full meal. Saloons made large batches. Boiled eggs steeped in a vinegar brine with salt, mustard seed, peppercorns, garlic, and sometimes beet juice or chili peppers for color and heat. After soaking for days or weeks, they turned sour, salty, and spicy. compact protein bombs. No fork needed, grab one, crack it, and swallow. They were often sold for a few cents and set on the bar beside a tin of salt or hot sauce. Some saloons paired them with beer or whiskey, a sort of Old West happy hour combination. Today, pickled eggs may seem minor, but in 1870, on a trail headed nowhere in particular, they were as close to fast food as existed. Hardtack and gravy. Hardtack, called toothbreakers or molar chippers, was a survival biscuit made from flour, water, and salt. Baked until bone dry and frequently harder than the knife used to cut it, hardtack was intended to last for years rather than days. But saloons had a way of making it bearable. They would break hardtack into pieces, soak it in water or broth, and ladle hot pan gravy over it, typically made from salt pork drippings, flour, and pepper. Sometimes chopped onions or a little bacon were stirred in for extra depth. To a cowboy, this felt like a touch of civilization after days of chewing on tough trail rations. It was hardly elegant, yet it was warm, filling, and when drowned in gravy, oddly comforting. In many respects, that simple plate sums up cowboy cooking. Use what you have, waste nothing, and never underrate the value of a good pan of grease. Buffalo roast. In the early days of westward expansion, before cattle ranches dominated the range, buffalo ruled the plains. Millions of bison roamed, and frontier saloons, especially those near rail lines or hunting camps, sometimes offered roasted buffalo as a top-tier dish. The meat was lean, dark, and richly flavored, more like venison than beef. Saloons roasted large joints over open-fire pits or in cast-iron ovens, basting with animal fat, salt, and any herbs on hand. The most coveted cut was the hump roast, which could become remarkably tender when slow-cooked. Buffalo was often thinly sliced and served with gravy or alongside potatoes. In mining boomtowns, buffalo could fetch a higher price than beef, not due to scarcity but because demand was strong. It was a prestige dish, available only at the better saloons, and cowboys who could spare the money ordered it to mark a big win or a rich payday. Ironically, the dish's popularity contributed to the bison's near extinction by the late 1800s. For a time, though, buffalo roast was the centerpiece of frontier feasts. Biscuits and molasses, simple, sticky, satisfying. For cowboys too worn out for meat and too short on cash for eggs, biscuits and molasses were a lifesaver. Biscuits were mixed from flour, lard, salt, and water or sour milk. No yeast, no sugar. Baked fast in a Dutch oven or a skillet, they came out with a crisp exterior and a flaky interior. Saloon kitchens kept them on hand all day long. Thick, dark, shelf-stable molasses was ladled over them like a frontier syrup. It was more than a simple treat. It was frontier fuel, giving cowboys a hit of sugar and carbohydrates after long rides or before they headed back out on the trail. In some saloons, biscuits with molasses doubled as dessert, especially when fruit or pie fillings were not available. But why did this dish stick around? Because it tasted like home, particularly for cowboys raised in the South, where molasses and biscuits were a childhood memory in every bite. Fried calf brains. You will not see this on most modern menus, but in the Wild West, nothing went to waste, especially not in a saloon trying to feed travelers on a tight budget. After a steer was butchered, the brains were cleaned, sliced, battered, and fried until golden and crisp. They were served with mustard, chopped onions, or hot sauce, and in some towns, fried calf brains were treated as a delicacy, particularly where German, French, or Mexican culinary traditions made offal more accepted. The texture was creamy inside and crunchy outside. The flavor was mild, almost like eggs. Cowboys who grew up poor did not flinch. They knew that if it was fried, it was fair game. Some saloons even paired it with eggs and bread as a kind of frontier brain breakfast. It might sound shocking now, but in that era it was simply sensible cooking. Game jerky, venison, elk, antelope. Jerky was not only trail grub, it was a saloon staple too. Hunters returning from the woods brought smoked and dried strips of venison, elk, or antelope, which saloons bought, traded for, or prepared themselves. The meat was cured with salt, smoked, and sun-dried, often seasoned with black pepper, red pepper flakes, or herbs such as sage or juniper. The jerky was tough and chewy and full of flavor. It would not spoil and required no heating, which made it perfect for both the trail and the saloon, and it went down well with a shot of rye or a mug of beer. Some saloons even offered jerky plates, thin slices of dried meat served with pickles or cheese. It was the original bar snack, long before pretzels or peanuts. And if you were traveling light and needed something for your saddlebag, the barkeep might wrap a few pieces in cloth and send you on your way. Jerky was more than survival rations. It stood for self-reliance. You killed it, you cured it, you carried it. Out west, that sort of food earned you respect. Miners' pot pie. In towns where mining and saloons overlapped, cooks needed dishes that were filling, cheap, and easy to make in large batches. Enter the miner's pot pie, a hearty meat and dough dish that helped inspire later American comfort foods. Different from the modern creamy version, this pie typically used rough-cut beef, rabbit, or even squirrel, stewed with onions and root vegetables, then poured into a heavy pan lined with pastry if flour was available. Some cooks topped the filling with biscuit dough instead of a full crust. Pot pies were baked in communal ovens behind the saloon or beside the blacksmith's forge. They were sold by the slice or served in tin pans, often accompanied by pickles or leftover beans. To the average cowboy or miner, it was as close to a home-cooked dinner as they would get. Sitting down with a bubbling, gravy-filled pot pie and a pint of beer, let the dusty, dangerous world outside wait for a while cornmeal mush with tallow drizzle. Before grits became a southern diner staple, cornmeal mush was a frontier mainstay, especially in saloons serving budget-minded cowboys and railroad hands. The dish was straightforward, inexpensive, and surprisingly satisfying. Cornmeal cooked slowly in water or milk until it turned thick and creamy. The mixture was then poured into a tin pan, left to cool and firm up into a loaf, and cut into thick slices that were pan-fried until golden. Some saloons paired it with molasses or sorghum for sweetness, but others went entirely savory, drizzling it with rendered beef tallow, sometimes mixed with salt and black pepper. Cornmeal mush never pretended to be elegant. For men who had not seen a home kitchen in months, though, it brought warmth, a sturdy mouthfeel, and enough fat to quiet a growling stomach. It was the frontier version of polenta, made for boots-on-the-ground survival. Wild turkey and dumplings. When beef was too costly and buffalo too scarce, saloons in wooded areas often relied on wild game, and few plates were as beloved as turkey and dumplings. Built from foraged birds, wild turkeys, not the store-bought variety, the dish began with a long, slow simmer to soften the tough meat. After shredding, the turkey went back into a hearty broth seasoned with herbs, onions, garlic, and pepper. The dumplings were rough spoonfuls of flour dough stirred in toward the end, swelling like clouds in a storm. It was plain, yes, but when done right, it was deeply comforting. Cowboys remembered it as the closest thing to Sunday supper back home. In the right saloon, it could even make a gambler pause mid-hand. Dried apple pie. Fresh fruit out west was a rarity, but dried apples were prized. Carried by wagon or rail, dried apples were soaked to rehydrate, then spiced with cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar to make a filling for early saloon pies. Crusts came from flour, lard, and water, no butter, no frills, rolled thick to survive high-heat cast-iron baking. Some pies were covered, others left open, depending on the dough on hand. These pies were not light and flaky. They were dense, durable, and built to travel. One bite of that sweet, stewed apple center, often sticky and tart with a smoky note from the oven, sent cowboys back to orchards they had not seen in years. A slice cost a few cents, but to some men it was worth more than the whiskey. Fried corn cakes, Johnny cakes. Johnny cakes, known as fried corn cakes, were the flatbread of the frontier. They originated with indigenous communities and were taken up by settlers. Later cowboys and saloon cooks made them a reliable staple. The batter was simply cornmeal, boiling water, and a pinch of salt, dropped by spoonfuls onto a hot griddle and fried until the edges curled and the top browned. Sometimes they arrived at the table with sorghum or molasses, but more often they were plain, serving as an edible plate under stew or beans. In saloons, Johnny cakes were the go-to bread for fast orders and noisy patrons. They did not crumble, did not spoil, and could be made in dozens without any fancy equipment. Some cowboys called them trail flapjacks. Others just said they were hot and good. Everyone who worked the range agreed. If the cook turned out good Johnny cakes, he was worth following. Cow tongue in brown gravy. Cow tongue may sound odd today, but in Wild West saloons it was treated like a premium cut, full of flavor, tender, and well-suited to long, slow cooking. Because it required lengthy preparation, only saloons with a proper cook and steady customers offered it. The tongue was boiled for hours with spices and onions, then peeled, sliced, and seared before being smothered in a thick, dark gravy made from pan drippings and flour. It was commonly served with potatoes, cornbread, or fried apples on the side. The texture was silky and the taste rich and meaty. This was not trail fare. It was comfort food for seasoned cowboys, gamblers, or town marshals who had a little extra coin. And if you lucked into the last portion, you did not share. You savored it. Pinto bean chili, without tomatoes. Before canned tomatoes and blended chili powders were common, cowboys made chili the frontier way. Pinto beans, dried chiles, chunks of beef, and little else. Many early saloon versions avoided tomatoes entirely, especially in Texas, where red chili stews were built around dried ancho or pasilla peppers ground by hand. The meat was seared in tallow, the beans were soaked overnight, and the whole pot was left to simmer for hours. Some saloon cooks tossed in wild garlic, onions, or even a dash of coffee to deepen the flavor. Others kept it lean and simple: beef, beans, heat. That chili was more than food. It worked like medicine, lived as myth, and sold the place. Some saloons even billed it as the bowl of red that bites back. Served with a hunk of sourdough or eaten straight from a spoon, it warmed the bones and steadied the spirit. And if you asked for it mild, the barkeep would laugh and slide the pot a little closer. Bread pudding with whiskey sauce. Not every cowboy loved sweets, but those who did often turned to bread pudding, a practical dessert made from old biscuits, stale bread, or leftover cornbread soaked in milk, sugar, and eggs. It was the original waste-not dish, baked until golden and served in soft, spiced spoonfuls. Some cooks stirred in raisins or dried apples. Others ladled a warm sauce over the top, usually whiskey mixed with sugar and butter, poured on just before serving. Bread pudding did not always appear on the menu, but when it did, it meant someone in the kitchen had taken the time. It was slow food, a thoughtful dish, often offered to travelers who had been riding for days and needed something that tasted like care. Fried trout with cornmeal crust. In mountain towns and river settlements, saloons frequently offered fresh-caught trout, dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried in pork fat until the outside was golden and crisp. Unlike beef or buffalo, fish did not need long cooking, and when the stagecoach brought guests from back east, trout was treated as the more refined option. The fish was often served whole, head-on and bones intact, sometimes accompanied by pickled onions or boiled potatoes. But the essential part was the crust, salty and crackly, made from coarse ground cornmeal and black pepper. Gooseberry cobbler. Gooseberries popped up wild across the foothills and plains, and for many saloon cooks, they were the key to an authentic Western cobbler. Tart, tangy, and a perfect foil for a sweet biscuit topping. The cook simmered the berries with sugar into a jam-like filling, ladled it into cast iron pans, and dropped thick spoonfuls of dough over the top. Some saloons served it with fresh cream, others simply dusted it with sugar. The taste was striking, sour and sweet at once, and it became a favorite of old-timers and cowboys who had grown up foraging. Gooseberry cobbler was, in a way, the taste of the untamed country folded into something warm and tender, scrapple. Taken from Mid-Atlantic and Pennsylvania Dutch traditions but present in Wild West saloons by the late 1800s, scrapple was a practical, frugal breakfast made by combining pork scraps, liver, cornmeal, and spices into a dense loaf, then slicing and frying it. It was inexpensive, filling, and straightforward to make in large batches, ideal for early morning saloon service, especially in cold weather. With a crisp exterior and a soft center, it was fine on its own, though many cowboys topped it with molasses, mustard, or eggs. Scrapple might have sounded odd, but it filled bellies and kept men going. In a world where nothing went to waste, it celebrated thrift and made comfort out of scraps. So were these 25 recipes actually served in Wild West saloons? Yes, every single one of them. Saloons were more than whiskey dens. They were the proto-diners, the first truck stops, the only places a cowboy could find a hot plate between dust storms, gunfights, and long rides west. Some dishes were odd, some were plain, and some you probably wish you had tried earlier. If this video left you craving the Old West, give it a like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more lost American food stories. Tell us in the comments, which dish would you try, and which one would you never touch with a 10-foot pole? Now saddle up, timekeepers, and click here. Our next video will revive even more flavors from the past.